Over the last 4 years, I've made 4 albums. When I began, I didn't know a thing. I couldn't produce, I thought mixing was moving faders up and down, and I definitely didn't even know what mastering was. I began making music the same way a lot of us do, in a small bedroom with a $100 guitar, the cheapest interface you could find, and free software. There's been a lot of growing pains. There's things I wish I did differently, or advice I wish I didn't listen to because it's just wasted my time. But after 4 years, and I admit that's not a long time for a creative endeavor, I still do make mistakes. I'm finally at a point where I'm proud of my work and excited about it, instead of dreadful to listen to the recordings because I'll just hear the mistakes. Perfectionism. One of my friends is just starting to grow plants for the first time. I used to work at a nursery, so I've been helping him water and fertilize and find lighting situations that would be good for them, just in hopes that he can avoid that period where you buy a bunch of plants and then you kill them all. I have definitely killed a bunch of songs, I'll tell you that. So I wanted to make this video in hopes to alleviate some of those growing pains and dead songs. I still make mistakes all the time, so I don't claim to be somebody that you should really be taking advice from. I'm not a professional, I just do things in my bedroom. But I can tell you how to avoid killing some plants and some songs. So I've structured this video into 3 parts: idea generation, song improvement, and personal philosophy. These are in no particular order or significance. I've tried to arrange them in a way that is somewhat coherent, but for the most part, it's just a collection of lessons that I wish I had when I started. So without further ado, let's get into the first section, idea generation. My first piece of advice when it comes to idea generation is to change up your process. I would say that this is something that I apply most often. I feel like when you're comfortable in your studio or your space or wherever you spend most of your time, it'll lead to similar thought patterns and therefore similar ideas. So I like coming outside as a way to break the monotony, but it can even be as simple as writing on an instrument that you don't normally pick up for songwriting, switching what hour of the day you decide to work. Things like this, little pieces of details, those actually matter. I've been using the same background for all of my work forever, so I'm going to switch it up. Come on. Sometimes just a change in scenery is all you need. Guitars and other stringed instruments, although this is a more specific example, have a built-in method for changing your process, and that's with the use of alternate tunings. Some of my best songs have been made with alternate tunings because it forces me to get out of my comfort zone and to use chords that I wouldn't normally use and to not think about music theory. So it leads to a more focused songwriting process for me personally. And it's more fun, because it's experimental. My other piece of advice, on the contrary to changing up your process, is to actually have a habitual creative process. This sounds counterintuitive to the last one, but there's a book that I would recommend every creative to read, which is called The War of Art by Steven Pressfield, and in it he uses the invocation of the muse every time he starts to write, and that gets him in that space of creative process. So that's not to say you can't change up your process and not use that habit. For instance, if I'm going outside or staying in my studio to write a song, I would still cite my mantra, and that would get me in the headspace for creating. Let's move on to the next piece of advice. This piece of advice comes from George Harrison. He says to not sit on ideas, and if you have one, drop everything you do and go write that song. If you sleep around on an idea for a day, a week, a month, it loses the essence of what it originally was. However, if you let it sit for long enough, it becomes stale, and perhaps you'll forget about it. This has happened with me, where I think an idea sucks, and then I give it some time, and I come back to it a year or 2 years or more later, and I realize, I can work with that. I took a photography class in university, and one of our assignments was to create an ad campaign. It was left as vague as that. And my professor taught us to take a large concept or an idea, something unachievable, and start shrinking it down into bite-sized pieces that become more tangible to take action towards. So for instance, if I was making an ad campaign on rice, I'd want to narrow that down further. One step below that, let's say I wanted to talk about sustainability in rice farming. To get even more specific, maybe I look at a certain town that's really known for sustainability in rice farming, and then narrow it down to a specific business. In terms of songwriting, that's a little more abstract, but I've used this trick to take an emotion, let's say happiness. I would go into that as a broad topic about what energy I want my song to be. Maybe I would look at a memory that makes me happy. And then going further into that, a moment that makes me really happy. Let's say I really love camping, so one specific camping trip makes me really happy as a song topic. And then narrow it down to a specific moment in that trip. Maybe it's having a cup of black coffee on a campfire. That is how you use that trick to be a little bit more specific in terms of what you want to write about or an emotion that you want to tackle. One quick idea is to create with intention. So if you sit down in your instrument, have a goal to create. Don't just endlessly noodle trying to look for an idea. Take something that you're feeling and put it into your craft. If I'm feeling like I want to have a somber piano piece, have a somber piano piece. And don't feel the need to just noodle. Stay focused. When I'm stuck on a song, sometimes the easiest way to get out of that rut is to play with form and structure. There's nothing wrong with verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, but it might inspire you to try something else. Maybe a song with all verses or a song with all bridges. Anything to get out of the monotony of what you usually create. Inversions on piano and guitar for chords and other instruments are also a helpful way to get out of this monotony. And sometimes the best thing that you can do for an idea is to sleep on it. If you've been working on something for too long, there's a chance that you become acclimated to it, and the best way to get a new perspective is to get a fresh night's rest. I've been out here for a little long tonight, so I'm going to take a break, and I'll see you tomorrow for song improvement. Although I said that these pieces of advice don't have a ranked order to them, I do believe for song improvement that this is one of the more important pieces of advice I've ever received. I think that creativity is an iterative process, where you start from a foundation and over time you slowly build up to a complete body of work. The little decisions that you make along the way add up exponentially, so the advice is, pay attention to the really small details because over time they add up. Take, for example, the scale of measurement, decibels. A 10 dB source plus a 10 dB source does not equal 20 decibels. It adds up exponentially and becomes a little bit louder than 20 dB. The same can be said for the tiny decisions like which pick you decide to use on the guitar, or if you use a pick at all, if you place a microphone half an inch to the left or half an inch to the right, or the tiny, tiny compressor settings and reverb settings like attack and release, decay time, these sort of decisions. It's about what becomes larger than the sum of their parts. The same can be said about bad decisions. A tiny bunch of little mistakes in recording and technique add up to a complete gerbil of mess. So, by extension, another piece of advice is to get it right on the foundational level. If you're recording something, take your time to do it correctly. put your mics in the right spot, attenuate your gain and do gain staging correctly, and then you won't have to be fixing things. You'll be able to move on creatively. To continue the theme of small details, one thing that's worth paying attention to is that occasionally, imperfection becomes perfection. And I have two examples for this. Firstly, if you're recording a piece of music live, like a drum take, for example, your first thought may be to quantize the take after the fact. If you're going for that sound, that's fantastic. Quantize to your heart's content. But sometimes, by leaving in the small timing mistakes, you actually add to the groove and give the listener something that sounds familiar. Something of an uncanny valley effect happens when you strip out what we're used to hearing out in the real world. If you were to go to a band in concert, they're not necessarily quantizing their drum takes live on the spot. When you take away something like natural reverb from a room and add in a very clinical studio environment, the listener is aware that you're not doing something that they're used to hearing, which may be jarring or be something that's distracting. The second example I have is the perfection and hi-fi-ness of digital recording. We've gotten to a point where technology is so good that noise floor, saturation from analog gear, and built-in compression just isn't really a thing. What I mean by built-in compression is that gear of old used to saturate and distort sound quality if you pushed it hard enough, which would limit a dynamic range and provide natural compression without actually compressing. Adding things like noise or tape emulation or saturation and distortion back into a recording can add a lot of the quality that we're used to hearing in classic recordings. That's not to say that there's anything wrong with digital recording, because it is amazing to have such accessible technology that is so high fidelity available at our fingertips. But again, if you want your audience to be reminded of the history of music that we have behind it, it might be a good idea to use these things like emulation and saturation to recreate the environments that we're used to hearing music in. I have one more piece of general advice before we move on to some smaller, more nuanced and personal song improvement ideas. And that is that simplicity sometimes is the best thing that you can do for complexity. As a bedroom producer, I have a tendency to be really fixated on the part that I'm playing. If I'm playing a drum part or a piano part or a bass part, I want it to be as complex as possible because that's what I'm paying attention to as I'm playing it. And sometimes it's best to embody the role of a producer or a session musician where you're thinking about the entire track instead of just exactly what you're playing. I have this fear, and I think at this point it's just an insecurity that if I don't play the most complicated, complex thing I can, that somehow I'm not showing my chops as a musician or that I'm not good. When in fact that couldn't be farther from the truth. The way that you show your chops is by creating excellent composition, no matter the simplicity or the complexity of the parts involved. It is the interaction between parts that offers depth, nuance, and complexity. And most of the time, if you add up a lot of simple parts, it adds up into a complex part. So while you're playing, don't be insecure about playing a very simple part, because to steal an analogy from cooking, there are only so many spices, seasonings, and ingredients that you can use at your disposal. It's about how you apply those and in tandem with each other can create a combination that becomes unique. Just because everybody has access to salt doesn't mean that using salt is basic. It is one of the simple foundational parts of cooking, and the same goes for music. So don't fear simplicity, embrace it, and use it to your advantage. Now let's move on to some more personal parts, and I think this venue is a little bit too big for that, so let's head on over back to the studio. Welcome back to the studio. I mentioned how insecurity plays a role in overplaying and choosing negative parts for your songs that don't help contribute to the overall complexity of your songs. The reason for this is because when we're creating, we open ourselves up and our ego is at full display. Sometimes that might feel like we're under assault. Our job as artists, creatives, musicians, whatever your trade or creative endeavor may be, what we're trying to do is be in service of what we're making, and in this case, be in service of the song. Do not let your ego dictate what part would be right for your song, because as soon as you personally step in with your own feelings and emotions, separated from the emotions of writing and what you're putting into your work, It's how you feel about what you're doing that will impact what you create. Sometimes a part just won't work for a song no matter how hard you try to make that work. So don't get over-attached to any particular idea because of your own ego. It may be a cool idea and it might be right for another song, but don't get too attached. Hold it off for later. At the same time, if an idea just isn't working for a whole song, don't be afraid to just scrap it altogether and move on to something else. A friend sent me a song today that contains some of the most interesting mixing decisions I've heard in some time, where everything was hard panned left and right, and it had an auto pan on it, so the song kind of revolved around your head at points. It was a decision for the sake of making a decision. To sound cool, maybe? It did not work in service of the song. It added very little besides the fact that it completely ruined my immersion. A similar thing happened in the new Father John Misty album, which was pretty good in general, but there was a specific song where the entire vocal was layered with this rotor effect that, again, completely broke my immersion of the song and my enjoyment of it, because all I could hear was that rotor effect and I couldn't stop paying attention to it. So don't make decisions just to make decisions. If they're not working for the song, you're only hurting yourself by putting those weird decisions in there. So create with purpose and make decisions for a reason instead of just trying to be flashy or seem cool or do something unique and interesting. If there's a reason for it, excellent. But if not, maybe consider a different approach. The last thing I have to say about song improvement is a bit obvious and pretty clear-cut, but bear with me because it is important, and that is to get into the habit of finishing songs. Not only will this net you more experience, it'll give you a clear-cut definition of what you like, what you don't like, and what your style as an artist is, which are all important for creating an ethos for yourself as a creative. When you get into the healthy habit of creating, that becomes more and more commonplace, and you're able to do it with more regularity. And that's what we all want. We all want more complete songs, and that's what you should strive for, is finishing songs to completion. Again, there's the caveat of, if a song's not working out, don't worry about it. If it's a bad idea, it's a bad idea. But in general, finishing songs will help you get to your end goal a little bit faster. It's a bit obvious, but that is what it is. It's getting a bit late, and I think I want to take a walk for this last bit, so come join me for personal philosophy. This section will be by far the most subjective, but I think at the end of the day, the most important thing about art is that it is the description of human experience, and the most important thing is to be honest with yourself and your experiences. Art is about valuing that honesty, and if you betray what you want because you're self-conscious about what you have to say, or you're insecure about your ideas, then you and the rest of the world misses out on a more rich human experience, and it's important to be honest with yourself. If you hesitate on your ideas and your honesty, that is what makes them fail. To borrow an analogy from cooking, you can make a masterpiece of a meal, technically proficient in every way, executed at the highest level, and still that dish may not be to some people's tastes and preferences. That's to say, not everybody will like your music, and that's okay, because once you realize that, you can stop being beholden to other people's opinions and make what you want to make. This ties into honesty as well. If you're honest with yourself and you know what you're going after, execute it on a higher level. It's easy to base your actions off isolated feedback, but because everybody's tastes and preferences are different, you can't account for all of that. So by aggregating a large collection of people's opinions on your music, it'd lead to a more accurate representation of everything. That being said, though, whatever you're making right now is fantastic. The fact that you're making anything at all is wonderful, because the world needs more creations. And where you're at right now is perfectly adequate. To quote Radiohead, oh God, The best you can is good enough. I also wanted to make the caveat that I don't know everything or claim to know everything. In fact, we're all learning. Just because I've made 4 albums doesn't make me more or less qualified than you are to give wisdom at your leisure. But I think it's important to recognize that I neither know nor claim to know. And I think that's the best way to go about life in general, is to be unassuming and to try and learn as much as you can. Advice is hyper-specific to the individual, and so not everything I've said in this video can apply to you, but it is helpful to gain a new perspective, and that's what I'm trying to do all the time. I think the best thing you can do for yourself is to imagine yourself as the listener and to kind of embody that viewpoint to critically analyze your own work, and that's a big way that you can improve things. It is getting quite late and quite dark, so I think I'm going to wrap things up. I only have 2 more things for you. Well, we have concluded the end of our journey. Second to last thing I have for you, something that you've heard a lot. There are no rules. There's only wisdom to lead you in the right direction. I'll leave you with this. Perhaps the most simple thing I'll say. Write as much as you can. Read a lot and listen frequently. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really appreciate you sticking around towards the end. This was a lot of fun to make. I have some other plans to do some videos, but I've got music to make, so who knows if that'll happen. Speaking of music to make, I have a new album coming out in October called Weather for Gardening, and I could not be more thrilled for you to hear it when it's released. I am so proud of this for the first time, working past my insecurities and technical improficiencies to bring you, hopefully, a really fun album and a fun record. Well, that's all. My name's Braelen Addison. Thank you again for watching. Have a great night. Okay, take care now.